Welcome back to the screencast for Political Philosophy, Lehman College, spring 2020. It turned out my recording software had not frozen, but it's good to break up long lectures into smaller chunks. So when I did cut off the last video, we were talking about moral relativism and why it's difficult to extricate or pull out or separate morality from political and social development. Oh, I was on the second video here, or the second slide of moral relativism. Okay, there we go. So if we've figured out that you can't pull out all a moral evaluation out of political and social development, what does that mean? Should we be relativists? There are some very, very strong objections to pure moral relativism, even though it comes from good motivations to not be imperialist, not be colonialist, not use your power to try and force your way of life on other people. Still, there is the objection that we wouldn't make any moral progress, and now I'm recalling that I said that in the previous video. The idea that we have more in common than we do differences, and the idea that we use reason to understand each other all the time. Nussbaum focuses a lot on number 2, our commonalities, the idea that we have a common set of characteristics and ways of living that make us human. She doesn't want to totally dismiss the relativists, though. She recognizes that our classical traditions have not been sensitive to cultural differences in values and ways of life and deciding what's good, deciding what it means to be a good person. So she wants a theory or a framework that is sensitive to that and still finds the deepest commonalities that we all share as human beings. So she allows for being embedded in history. That's what historicity is. For differences in cultural values and for different sets of experiences. She acknowledges that the rights approach, when we think of natural rights or God-given rights that we've been talking about quite a lot, or utilitarian approaches in which a government or a set of laws is good if it creates more benefit than it does suffering. She says we can all take a look at the world and see what that's led to. There are some big gaps in these types of theories because we have massive inequality. We have massive injustice all over the world. Historically, the poor have not been included in these rights conceptions or these utilitarian conceptions. Women have not, nor have people of color. So she asks us if we use a commonalities approach, which is going to be this capabilities approach, is it going to help us develop a system that doesn't allow for this inequality and injustice? She mentions the 3 major objections the relativist or the anti-universalist constantly brings up when someone tries to find a common list of humanity or a common definition of humanity. First, the relativist would say, well, you're neglecting cultural differences. You're neglecting historical differences that shape worldviews, that shape values. And here's a quote from page 503. Nussbaum says, people, it is claimed, understand human life and humanness in widely different ways, and any attempt to produce a list of the most fundamental properties and functions of human beings is bound to enshrine certain understandings of the human and demote others. Okay, so some people might value collectivity. Some people might value individualism. Some people might value freedom of choice, while other people would rather be safe and protected. That's what this objection is trying to say, but Nussbaum says it's not all that clear. She goes on to say, in particular, it's far from clear that it supports the idea that we ought to base our ethical norms instead on the current preferences and self-conceptions of people. Okay, so what does that mean? She says the relativist just wants to take a poll. Well, let's call everybody, and if they support the death penalty, it's morally okay, and if they don't, it's not morally okay. She says, no, that's not how morality and politics work. We're not looking for a survey of people's biases and beliefs at this very moment. We are looking for something that runs underneath, something that's not relative. Another objection that the relativist says is that we neglect autonomy. Every human being should have the ability to make their own choices in life. That's what autonomy is. You're an agent. You are the driver of your actions and goals. But Nussbaum points out that that itself is a universalist conception, that they're sneaking it in there even though they say there's no such thing as a universal truth about humanity. They're saying that everybody should have freedom of choice and autonomy, which is in itself a universalist statement. Nussbaum also notes that an objection from the relativist is that we have applied these universal rules in a prejudiced way. And I talked about that in the previous slide. That's kind of the point of Nussbaum is making. She thinks that just because we have used it prejudicially in the back, in the history, that doesn't mean that we should totally let go of humanity as a guiding concept. Okay. So this is on page 504, and this is her first attempt at explaining the capabilities approach. This also might be a good time for me to step back and talk about why she calls it the capabilities approach. So sometimes we have things like utilitarian theory or rights theory, and she didn't want a word that strong, neither did Sen, the economist, because they wanted it to be flexible enough to be sensitive to these cultural and historical contexts people are in, more of a framework with which any culture could say, we have the basics of what it means to live a good human life. And here she explains it on a long quote from page 504 and 505. She says, the basic idea is that we ask ourselves, what are the characteristic activities of the human being? What does the human being do characteristically as such, and not as a member of a particular group or a particular community? To put it another way, what are the forms of activity, of doing and being, that constitute the human form of life? Something that is universal to everybody. And she says, if we want to answer these questions thoroughly, we need to figure out what you need to be included in the group human being. What makes you a human? And think about it in one way. You can say, is there something that if I lost it, this capability, ability, this limitation, I would no longer classify myself as a human being? Who do we include, and who do we exclude, and why? And this is a list, her first list of several, to explain how we're going to look for these human capabilities and these human limitations. She wants to make sure that you know that this account of what it means to be human is actually rooted in real experience that we have available to us, hundreds and even thousands of years of recorded history and empirical lives that we can look at and see the commonalities too. It's not an ahistorical, hard theory that tries to tell us facts about human nature. But we will be looking at the humanness of everybody, regardless of how different their cultural context is. It's not a biological definition. We don't care about DNA. We don't care about body structure only, even though we will, she says, care about biology to the extent that it shapes our human experiences universally. But that's not what she means when she says we're looking for our commonalities. It's also not a metaphysical one. So she doesn't want an abstract, rational definition of what it means to be a human. You might have encountered the idea of personhood in your past philosophical studies. That is a metaphysical definition of humanity, where you make lists like, well, they need to be able to reason, and they need to be able to feel, and they need, etc., etc. So she says we're not making a definition that's either biological or metaphysical, though we use some of those elements. We are making an evaluative list. What does it mean to be human? We evaluate it case by case by making a judgment. She says it's tentative and open-ended, again, to reflect people's contexts. She says that, yes, we all have limitations as human beings, and we all have capabilities, and some of these things are viewed differently by different cultures, but she's still saying that they all have those limits and capabilities. We might be able to come to a consensus with people that value different things to us, but it must be through a reasonable procedure. Of course, I've mentioned this several times, so we could talk about it a little more in depth here. Contains both limitations and capabilities. So we're capable of certain things, of work, of imagination, of formulating goals and reasoning, but we also have lots of limitations, like we need air, we need water, we need food, we need shelter. We have probably a max lifespan that we could possibly have. So we have both things. We're both needy and capable. And here it is, the conception of personhood. Sometimes it can seem similar to the capabilities approach, but she wants to add that it is empirically centered, not purely reason alone. Okay, so here are the list of 11 things that she thinks are empirically sensible categories that are common to all human beings. And this starts on page 508. We're all mortal. We all face death and will die. We all have a human body. There are certain things about our bodies that are culturally shaped. So you can imagine a very poor country with very little food. Our bodies are going to be more malnourished versus living in a relatively richer country. Our bodies are probably going to be less malnourished. So there are cultural things that affect the way your body works and develops, but we all have one. We all have a body that gives us certain needs, like the ones I mentioned, food, water, shelter, but also, in Nussbaum's words, certain possibilities for excellence. It sets limits to what everybody can value, okay? So if all of us have an upper limit to what we can do and a lower limit, those are the limits to how we can use our bodies. We all have a one I didn't mention that becomes important later is mobility. That's part of our body. That's part of the way we use our body to stay alive. If we don't have the capability to move around, our humanness or our abilities to fulfill our goals sinks way down. The way she puts it, it says, we met an anthropomorphic being from another planet, maybe, who never moved from birth to death. we would automatically have a strong suspicion that they were not human. And that's the way we can sort of think about these commonalities. If we encountered something that didn't have a body like ours, that didn't die, we wouldn't include them in the group of human beings. They might be moral creatures, they might be intelligent creatures, but they're not human beings. Another commonality, we all have the capacity for pleasure and the capacity for pain. Again, if we met some species that did not have the capacity for pleasure or for pain, we probably wouldn't regard them as human. Her fourth commonality, cognitive capability, including perceiving from the senses. You take in sensory data, imagining, thinking, making distinctions, and trying to understand. We all have an early infant development in which we are completely helpless and dependent on other beings for a very long time. And that ends up structuring what we value and the things we care about and feel later on in life. So again, if we met a being that was born as an adult, we wouldn't necessarily think of them as human. We all use practical reason. And this is the ability to plan and manage your own life, to try and reflect on what's good and how to get there, to practically get by in life. 7, affiliation with other human beings. We all do this. We're social animals. We need people. We try to develop friendships and professional relationships and families and communities. And we rely on this as human beings. We all have a relatedness to other species and to nature itself. We are interdependent with them as they are on, well, nature as in Earth is not dependent upon us, but we live in an interdependent network in which we can't live apart from other species and nature. Humor and play. She says on page 511, human life is wherever it is lived and it makes room for recreation and laughter. The next one, separateness. And this one's interesting. She says, of course, we have deep, complex social ties with one another, but we can't enter into anyone else's consciousness. We can't feel their pain or their pleasure. We can only describe it to one another. And we will be like this in our own consciousness from birth all the way to death. So even though there's a strong counter-reaction against individualism, we should always keep this in mind. We are separate. We have ways in which we're close, but we are our own selves. And we can imagine it, some sci-fi scenario where that isn't the case, where you have telepathy, or you have two minds that are always melded with one another. But as we are separate. And then she says for 11, we have strong separateness. And she thinks this is one of the reasons that communism, as Marx and Engels espoused it, is not an empirically sound way to organize society socially or politically. Here on page 512, she says, because of separateness, each human life has, so to speak, its own peculiar context and surroundings. Your own objects, places, history, particular friendships, locations, sexual ties, and they're not the same as anybody else's. Though societies vary a great deal in degree to the type of strong separateness that they permit and foster, there is no life yet known that really does fail to use the words mine and not mine. We use things, we respond to them, we have things that are important to us. And this is all a part of strong separateness. Okay, then she says this is a working list. It's two sorts of items. It's our limits and our capabilities. And here on page 513, she says, so this list of capabilities is a ground floor or minimal conception of the good in a human life. And since it's a ground floor, it does not fully determine the choice of a way of life, but regulates the parameters of what can possibly be chosen. And this is the role of rights in liberal political theory that we've been looking at for the rest of the semester. The next section is called the two thresholds. So she has this idea or this understanding that if you are underneath threshold number 1, you don't have one or more of the things on the list we just looked at. You're not separate. You're not mortal. You don't have basic needs like food, water, shelter. You didn't have a long period of infant development and helplessness. So you don't even come up to threshold 1. And you are not a part of the empirical definition of what it means to be a human being. So this might help us develop policies around things like end-of-life care, or what we do in a brain death situation, in a medically ethical, relevant situation. But once you do have those characteristics, you are up above threshold 1. Okay, so far so good. So we've done our job politically and socially if we get everybody above threshold 1, right? Nussbaum says no. That you can meet all those basic definitions or commonalities of what it means to be a human being, but you could still live a very miserable life if you have just the absolute minimum of shelter, water, food, connection to other people, ability to think or imagine, or any of the rest of that list. You still have what most reasonable people would think is not a good life. So her question is, how do we organize society in a way to get everybody, or as many people as possible, up above threshold 2? You might still have failures in life. You might have goals that you can't meet with your own power, but the possibilities are there for you to do so. So the first list that we looked at, like I said, gets you above threshold 1. And now the second list is going to get you above threshold 2. Okay. So this list starts on page 515. You need a normal human lifespan. Of course, not things that we can't control like illness, but we would want to have the structure of a political and social society that doesn't cut people's lives off prematurely. Number 2, everybody should have the ability to protect their health, get enough food, have opportunities for sexual partnerships, have reproductive choice and freedom, and the ability to move around freely. They need to be able to avoid unnecessary and non-beneficial pain. That one is pretty straightforward. Number 4, able to use your senses, able to reason, to imagine, to think. And within this, she also includes the fact that we're going to have to educate people, because we can't use our reason, our imagination, or our critical abilities unless we guide people on how to do so to the best of their abilities. Also, as part of this whole suite of things with cognition that she thinks is important to coming up above threshold 2 is the ability to choose your own spiritually enriching materials. And for some people, of course, that's religion, but that's not what she means. She means your spirit, your verve, whatever makes you passionate, because she also says, literary, musical, artistic, so forth. She thinks that this one ensures the traditional human right in the classical tradition of freedom of expression, with both respect to political and artistic speech, as well as freedom of religion. Number 5, the ability to have attachments to things and persons in the world. So this is protecting that social aspect of us. You should be able to affiliate with whoever you want, whether that's your family or people you agree with politically, or a book club, or someone you love, etc. The government needs to ensure that you have this possibility. Number 6, being able to form a conception of the good and engage in critical reflection about the planning of your own life. And she thinks that this is like a right to work. So we can't keep some section of human beings, like women, home and not able to choose their own goals or ends, what they think is a good life. But this could also include the poor, who have to often take whatever work is available to them just to barely survive. Number 7, the ability to live for others, have empathy, concern, friendship, and family affiliation. She thinks that this aids in developing the justice in a society and also helps to protect the freedoms of assembly and speech. Number 8, ability to live in concern for the wider environment, the animals, the plants, and the world of nature around us. The ability to laugh, play, and enjoy. And 10A and 10B get separated here. This would be the separateness and the radical separateness from the previous list. So you should have the ability to live your life and nobody else's. And what she means by that is that this would guarantee the rest of those old rights, those negative rights that we looked at whenever we look at a rights conception of political theory. So you should have freedom of marrying who you want to, reproductive choice, freedom of speech, freedom of employment, and not be interfered with. Also be able to live that separate life in the context you actually find yourself in. That's 10B. And she thinks this guarantees freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, and the fact that you can protect your own private property. So conclusions for this midpoint. I know it's a lot of lists, but she's trying to be as clear as possible. She says all of these components are important to get you above threshold 2. You can't say, well, I have a lot of number 4, even though I don't have any number 7, so I'm fine. They're not tradable. You need all of them to get above threshold 2. She also says that what would happen if we did get everybody up over threshold 2? Does that mean that we could still have massive inequality and injustice? Just everybody has better opportunities to fulfill their goals? And she says she has the hint that if we got everybody above threshold 2, we would necessarily have to be a lot more equal. But she's not sure. Since this is just the beginning, there might need to be an additional theory of equality added on. What I want you to think about before the next set of videos in a couple of days, I want you to think about what she's argued and whether or not you think that her capabilities approach would actually help to alleviate injustice or inequality. Also, I want you to think about what's different between this and a rights approach, or this and a utilitarian approach, and whatever similarities you might see in all 3 of them. And then the last thing you might think of is how Nussbaum would react to Marx. So in the next set of videos, we will look at the last half of this article, as well as some background to the comparison that I'd like you to do of a letter from John Adams. As always, please email me or comment down below if you have questions or confusion.